who is a convicted triple murderer who in a drunken rage killed 3 small children in England in 1973. On Friday the 13th of April 1973, the bodies of 3 children were found impaled on garden railings in Worcestershire, England. The murderer, the family's lodger and babysitter, David McGreavy. David Anthony McGreavy was born in Southport in 1951 to Bella and Thomas McGreavy. David was the second eldest of 6 children. As David's father was a sergeant in the Royal Signals, a lot of David's childhood was spent moving from one army base to another. This could mean that one year he was being educated in an army school in England and the next in Germany. But according to David's mother, living in Germany was his happiest time. The children picnicked and biked in the woods and even went skiing. David wasn't found guilty of arson, but of negligence. He was sentenced to 90 days detention. He also underwent psychiatric testing. His commanding officer never revealed the results, and his parents were given no explanation for his bizarre behaviour. To this day, that psychiatric report isn't available for public inspection, but the attempted arson indicated an impulsive individual unable to envisage the consequences of his actions. The boy who had stolen his mother's money and the man who had tried arson for revenge were one and the same. The only difference was now David had started to drink, and alcohol affected him greatly. In 1971, David was shore-based at Portsmouth Dockyard after a tour of the Far East on the HMS Eagle. He started a relationship with a woman called Mary. From January to April, they exchanged 2 letters a week. David's letters became longer and longer. Eventually, in April 1971, he meets Mary for the first time, and just a week later, at a social event in Birmingham, he proposes to her. Now, he hasn't actually really known this girl at all, but within 1 week of meeting her, he's proposing marriage. After the engagement, David saw Mary for 2 long weekends in June and July. After, his letter writing increased in length and intensity, but David's mother disapproved of her son's relationship. She said Mary suffered from quite significant health problems. She had some issues with her spine, and she was often in quite a lot of discomfort if this condition wasn't treated, and one day it could lead to her being paralysed. David's mother thought that Mary was a bit of a hypochondriac and that she was exaggerating, but David was absolutely besotted with Mary, so his mother's words went unheeded. The problem with David was that he always thought he knew best, and he wouldn't listen to either parent or anyone. By August of 1971, David's naval career was over for good, and he was dismissed. He turned up at his parents' house one day, looking very defeated, dropped his bags on the floor and said, attitude, arrogance, and affection for alcohol were often to blame. With nothing else in his life, David focused on the one good thing he did have, his fiancée Mary. He planned to marry her during the Christmas period of 1971. Despite being jobless and broke, he started to fantasize about having a big traditional and therefore expensive wedding. Mary would have settled for something less. She would have settled for a registry office ceremony, but David was quite determined that they were going to have this big church wedding, and it all became quite real at this point. This young man who wants to marry her, who's obsessed with having this big wedding, and she freaked out and she called it off on New Year's Eve of 1971. By January of 1972, David was living with his parents in the Midlands. He'd been discharged from the Royal Navy and his fiancée had left him. The 20-year-old David had no work and no money, but instead of being grateful for the roof over his head, he sat and sulked. David moved in with an old school friend, Clive Ralph. Clive lived with his pregnant wife Elsie. The couple already had 2 children, 3-year-old Paul and 20-month-old Dawn, and they lived not far from where David's parents lived. Their area was fast changing, but still retained the sense of community with which Elsie had grown up in. Dorothy Elsie Clay had married Clive Ralph, 5 years her senior, in September 1968, when she was just 16 years old. Pregnant with her first child Paul, it wasn't long before the second child Dawn arrived in 1971. Clive worked hard to provide for his growing family. He was a lorry driver, and David came to live with them because he'd had an argument with his parents. This is how it all started. David's arrival meant that when in September 1972, Elsie gave birth to the couple's third child, Samantha, there were 6 people living in just one small 2-bedroom house. She said, quote, David shared the bedroom with Paul. Samantha was only little, so she was still in a little cradle cot, and then Dawn had another bed with us. As the time was going on, we were going to look for a bigger place anyway, but it didn't get to that part. End quote. With Clive regularly away for work, David would act as an extra pair of hands helping out with childcare. He paid the couple £6 a week towards the rent and even cooked the occasional meal on a Sunday. Neighbours remember him as being a bit of a know-it-all, but otherwise harmless. This, however, all changed when David drank. He was well known by the local police, and they pulled him in once or twice. The classic case was, he's walking down one of the main streets in the middle of the road, walking the white lines to prove he wasn't drunk. It upset his dad because his dad lived not far away, and he kept telling him to keep off of the booze. But David didn't listen, and in a moment of drunken madness, he would forever shame his family and forever destroy another. On Friday the 13th of April 1973, though a small altercation took place prior to leaving the pub. After David had put a cigarette out in his friend's beer, Clive had picked David up from the Bucks Hill and brought him home to look after the children while he went to get Elsie from work. Somewhere between 10:15 and 11:15 p.m, a drunk David became infuriated with the Ralph children, beginning with the baby, Samantha, who had been crying for her bottle. David violently killed Samantha and then the other two children, each in a different manner. 8-month-old Samantha died from a skull fracture. 2-year-old Dawn had her throat slit, and 4-year-old Paul was strangled. After killing the 3 children, David went down to the basement and retrieved a pickaxe. He further mutilated their bodies with the pickaxe before impaling the 3 bodies on spikes of a raw iron fence in the neighbour's yard. He then left the house. David was arrested by police at 3:50 a.m. walking on a street